It was a Tuesday morning in Dallas, and Jasmine Crockett was getting ready for what she thought would be just another day at the courthouse. She had been practicing law for over 10 years, and she knew the routine by heart. Wake up early, grab a coffee, review her case files, and head to court to fight for people who needed her help. Jasmine wasn't just any lawyer. She was someone who truly cared about making a difference. For years, she had been taking on cases that other attorneys might avoid. Cases involving people who had been treated unfairly because of who they were or where they came from. She didn't do it for the money. Most of these cases paid very little, if anything at all. She did it because she believed everyone deserved a fair chance at justice. That morning, she was preparing for a housing discrimination case. A local family had come to her office 3 months earlier, clearly upset and frustrated. They had been looking for a place to live for weeks, calling landlords and visiting apartments. Everything seemed fine over the phone, but when they showed up in person, suddenly the apartments were no longer available. The same thing happened over and over again. The family knew what was really happening, but proving it was another matter entirely. That's where Jasmine came in. She had seen this pattern before, and she knew how to build a case that would stand up in court. She spent weeks gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, and preparing documents that would show exactly what had been going on. As she drove to the courthouse that morning, Jasmine felt confident about her case. She had done her homework, and she was ready to present a strong argument. The evidence was clear, and she believed that any fair-minded judge would see that her clients had been wronged. The Dallas County Courthouse was busy as always. Lawyers in suits hurried up and down the halls, carrying briefcases and talking on their phones. Court clerks moved between offices with stacks of papers. Police officers escorted people to various courtrooms. It was the kind of controlled chaos that Jasmine had grown used to over the years. She made her way to courtroom 312, where her case was scheduled to be heard. The room was exactly what you'd expect from a courthouse built in the 1980s. Wooden benches, fluorescent lighting, and that particular smell of old carpet and legal documents. She had been in this exact courtroom dozens of times before. Judge Harrison Matthews was already at his bench, reviewing papers and looking as serious as always. Jasmine had appeared before him several times over the years. He had a reputation for being tough and direct, but she had always found him to be professional, even when they disagreed on legal points. She respected judges who took their job seriously, even if they sometimes made decisions she didn't like. Other attorneys were setting up their materials at the counsel tables. The court reporter was testing her equipment. A few people sat in the gallery, probably family members or witnesses waiting for their cases to be called. Everything looked perfectly normal. Jasmine opened her briefcase and spread out her files on the table. She had organized everything carefully: witness statements, housing applications, phone records, and expert testimony about housing patterns in the area. She had even hired a private investigator to document similar incidents with other families. This wasn't just one isolated incident, it was part of a bigger pattern. Her clients, the Mitchell family, sat quietly in the front row behind her. They looked nervous, which was completely understandable. Most people never step foot in a courtroom in their entire lives, and here they were, about to tell their story to a judge and hope for justice. Jasmine had spent time preparing them for what to expect, but she knew they were still anxious. The opposing counsel was Robert Chen, a lawyer who worked for the property management company. Jasmine had dealt with him before on other cases. He was professional and competent, though they rarely agreed on much when it came to discrimination cases. He seemed to be preparing his arguments just as carefully as she was preparing hers. As the morning progressed, other cases were called and resolved. Jasmine watched and listened, getting a feel for the judge's mood and approach that day. Every judge had their own style, and experienced attorneys learned to read the room and adjust their presentation accordingly. When her case was finally called, Jasmine stood up and approached the counsel table with confidence. She had presented hundreds of cases over the years, and she knew how to speak clearly and persuasively. She believed in her clients, she believed in the evidence, and she believed in the law. She had no idea that this day would be different from any other day she had spent in court. She couldn't have imagined that within the next hour, everything she thought she knew about this courtroom and this judge would be turned upside down. She was about to witness something that would shock her to her core and set in motion a chain of events that would make headlines across the country. As she organized her papers one last time and prepared to make her opening statement, Jasmine felt the same sense of purpose that had driven her to become a lawyer in the first place. She was here to speak for people who needed someone to speak for them. She was here to seek justice in a system that didn't always deliver it fairly to everyone. What she was about to experience would test everything she believed about the law, about justice, and about the courage it takes to stand up when doing the right thing isn't easy. When the bailiff called her case, Jasmine stood up and walked to the podium with the same confidence she had shown in countless other courtrooms. She had her opening statement prepared, her evidence organized, and her witnesses ready. Everything was going according to plan until she began to speak. "Your Honor," she started, "this case is about a family who was denied basic housing opportunities based solely on their background. The evidence will show a clear pattern of discrimination that violates both state and federal fair housing laws." Judge Matthews looked up from his papers with an expression that seemed different somehow. His usual professional demeanor had been replaced by something else entirely. "Ms. Crockett," he interrupted, "are you sure you're in the right courtroom? This seems a bit complicated for someone of your experience level." Jasmine paused, surprised by the comment. She had appeared before this judge many times before, and he had never questioned her qualifications. "Yes, Your Honor, I'm confident. This is the correct venue for this matter. As I was saying, the evidence clearly demonstrates—" "Stop right there." The judge cut her off again, his voice getting sharper. "I'm having trouble understanding your argument. Maybe you should speak more slowly and use simpler words. Not everyone here went to those fancy law schools." The courtroom fell completely silent. Even the court reporter looked up from her machine, clearly uncomfortable with what she was hearing. The other attorney at the opposing counsel table shifted, nervously in his seat. This wasn't normal courtroom procedure, and everyone knew it. Jasmine felt her heart rate increase, but she maintained her composure. Years of experience had taught her how to handle difficult situations in court, though nothing quite like this. "Your Honor, I believe my presentation is clear and appropriate for these proceedings. May I continue with my opening statement?" Judge Matthews leaned back in his chair and studied her with obvious disapproval. "You know, Ms. Crockett, I'm wondering how someone like you even made it through law school. Did you actually earn your degree, or was it handed to you through some special program?" The question hit the courtroom like a physical blow. Several people in the gallery audibly gasped. The Mitchell family, sitting behind Jasmine, looked at each other in shock and confusion. They had never been in a courtroom before, but even they could tell that something was seriously wrong. Jasmine's hands trembled slightly as she gripped the podium, but her voice remained steady. "Your Honor, I respectfully request that we focus on the legal matters at hand. My qualifications are not relevant to this housing discrimination case." "Oh, but I think they are very relevant," the judge replied, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "When someone walks into my courtroom claiming to represent clients in complex civil rights matters, I have every right to question whether they're actually qualified to do so, especially when their appearance and manner suggest they might be more comfortable in different surroundings." The opposing attorney finally spoke up, clearly uncomfortable with the direction things were taking. "Your Honor, if I may, I believe we should proceed with the legal arguments in this case." Judge Matthews turned his attention to the other lawyer with a completely different tone. "Of course, Mr. Chen, I appreciate your professionalism. It's refreshing to work with attorneys who understand proper courtroom etiquette and who earned their positions through merit rather than quotas or special considerations." Jasmine realized what was happening. This wasn't about her legal arguments or her case preparation. This wasn't even about her qualifications as an attorney. Judge Matthews was attacking her personally, and his comments were crossing every line of professional conduct imaginable. "Your Honor," she said firmly, "I object to these personal comments. They are inappropriate and irrelevant to the legal proceedings." "You object?" The judge laughed coldly. You think you can come into my courtroom and tell me what's appropriate? Maybe you should go back to whatever community college taught you the law and learn some respect for judicial authority. The court reporter's fingers had stopped moving entirely. She was staring at the judge with obvious concern, clearly uncertain about whether she should be recording these comments. The bailiff looked equally uncomfortable, standing rigid by the door as if he wished he could disappear. Jasmine took a deep breath and made a decision that would change everything. Instead of backing down or asking for a recess, she decided to document every word, every gesture, every abuse of power she was witnessing. Her legal training kicked in, and she began to mentally catalog each inappropriate comment for the record. "Your Honor," she said clearly, making sure her voice carried to every corner of the courtroom, "I respectfully request that these comments be noted in the official court record. I also request that you recuse yourself from this case due to obvious bias." Judge Matthews's face turned red with anger. "How dare you question my impartiality? I've been on this bench for 15 years and I won't be lectured by someone who probably got her job through affirmative action rather than actual legal skill." The words hung in the air like poison. Everyone in the courtroom knew they had just witnessed something that would have serious consequences. The Mitchell family looked frightened and confused. Other attorneys in the gallery were pulling out, their phones presumably to contact colleagues about what they were seeing. But Jasmine wasn't intimidated. If anything, the judge's behavior had activated her fighting instincts. She had spent her entire career standing up for people who had been treated unfairly, and she wasn't about to stop now, even when she was the one being targeted. "Your Honor," she said with ice-cold professionalism, "I am formally requesting a mistrial based on judicial misconduct. These proceedings cannot continue under these circumstances." What Judge Matthews didn't realize was that his behavior had just triggered something much bigger than a simple courtroom dispute. Jasmine's mind was already working, connecting patterns and remembering other cases where attorneys had complained about similar treatment. She was beginning to suspect that what she was experiencing wasn't an isolated incident, but part of something much more systematic and dangerous. After the courtroom disaster, Jasmine walked out feeling like her entire world had been turned upside down. She had been practicing law for over a decade, and nothing like this had ever happened to her before. The way Judge Matthews had spoken to her wasn't just unprofessional, it was shocking and completely inappropriate. Instead of going straight back to her office, Jasmine sat in her car in the courthouse parking lot for nearly 20 minutes, trying to process what had just occurred. Her hands were still shaking slightly from the adrenaline, but her mind was already working like the experienced attorney she was. Something about the judge's behavior felt too calculated, too deliberate to be just a bad day or personal bias. The first thing she did was call her mentor, Patricia Williams, an older attorney who had been practicing civil rights law for over 30 years. Patricia had seen everything during her career, and Jasmine trusted her judgment completely. "Patricia, I need to talk to you about something that just happened in court," Jasmine said when her mentor answered the phone. "Judge Matthews said some things to me today that were completely out of line, and I'm not sure how to handle it." When Jasmine finished describing what had happened, there was a long silence on the other end of the phone. Finally, Patricia spoke, and her voice was deadly serious. "Jasmine, what you're describing sounds familiar. I've heard similar stories from other attorneys over the past few years, but nobody wanted to make a formal complaint because they were afraid it would hurt their careers." This was exactly what Jasmine had suspected, but hearing it confirmed made her stomach drop. "Other attorneys? How many others?" "At least 3 or 4 that I know of personally, and probably more who haven't spoken up. All women, all minority, attorneys, and all in cases involving civil rights or discrimination issues. I always wondered if there was a pattern, but I never had enough information to be sure." Jasmine felt a mixture of anger and determination building inside her. If Judge Matthews was systematically targeting attorneys like her, then this wasn't just about one bad courtroom experience. It was about corruption at the highest levels of the legal system. Over the next few days, Jasmine began making careful inquiries. She reached out to attorneys she knew and trusted, asking casual questions about their experiences with Judge Matthews. What she discovered was even worse than she had imagined. David Rodriguez, who handled employment discrimination cases, told Her about a hearing where the judge had questioned whether he was really qualified to handle complex legal matters. Lisa Thompson, who specialized in housing rights, described a case where Judge Matthews had made comments about attorneys who play the race card instead of focusing on real legal issues. The more people Jasmine talked to, the clearer the pattern became. Judge Matthews wasn't just having bad days or showing personal bias. He was systematically targeting minority attorneys, particularly those who represented clients in civil rights cases. His behavior was designed to intimidate them, make them feel uncomfortable, and hopefully convince them to settle cases quietly rather than fight in his courtroom. But Jasmine discovered something even more disturbing. As she dug deeper into the cases that had come before Judge Matthews, she noticed something strange about the outcomes. Cases involving housing discrimination, employment discrimination, and other civil rights issues had an unusually high settlement rate when they appeared in his courtroom. Either attorneys were withdrawing their cases or clients were accepting lowball settlement offers rather than going to trial. This wasn't just judicial bias. This was systematic interference with the legal process. Judge Matthews was using his position to influence the outcomes of civil rights cases, and he was doing it in a way that denied justice to people who had been discriminated against. Jasmine spent her evenings poring over court records, looking for patterns in case assignments, settlement rates, and judicial decisions. What she found was shocking. Over the past 3 years, Judge Matthews had handled an unusually high number of discrimination cases, and the outcomes were consistently unfavorable to plaintiffs. Even more suspicious, she discovered that many of the defendants in these cases were represented by the same law firms, and those firms seemed to have an unusually high success rate in Judge Matthews' courtroom. It was as if certain attorneys knew exactly how to get favorable treatment from the judge, while others, particularly minority attorneys representing discrimination victims, faced hostility and bias. The breakthrough came when Jasmine was having coffee with another attorney, Jennifer Park, who had been practicing law in Dallas for almost as long as she had. Jennifer mentioned something that made Jasmine's blood run cold. "You know," Jennifer said casually, "I've always thought it was weird how Judge Matthews seems to have such strong opinions about housing discrimination cases. My brother works for Pinnacle Development Group, and he mentioned once that the judge lives in one of their luxury communities. Small world, right?" Jasmine nearly dropped her coffee cup. Pinnacle Development Group was one of the largest property management companies in Dallas, and they had been defendants in at least a dozen discrimination cases that had come before Judge Matthews. If the judge had personal or financial ties to the company, it would explain everything she had been discovering. That night, Jasmine began researching Judge Matthews's personal finances and business relationships. What she found was like pieces of a puzzle falling into place. The judge didn't just live in a Pinnacle development community. He had received several loans and financial benefits from companies connected to Pinnacle. He was also a member of an exclusive country club that was partly owned by Pinnacle's parent company. The corruption was deeper and more systematic than she had imagined. Judge Matthews wasn't just showing bias against minority attorneys. He was actively working to protect the financial interests of companies he had personal relationships with. Every time he intimidated an attorney or influenced a case outcome, he was essentially stealing justice from people who had been discriminated against. Jasmine realized she had stumbled onto something much bigger than judicial misconduct. This was criminal corruption that had been going on for years, affecting dozens of cases and hundreds of victims. The question now wasn't whether she should report what she had found. It was how to do it in a way that would bring real justice and prevent Judge Matthews from destroying any more evidence or intimidating any more attorneys. Jasmine knew she had reached a point where this was too big for the normal legal system to handle. What she had discovered wasn't just about one judge behaving badly. It was about systematic corruption that involved money, influence, and the deliberate denial of justice to people who needed it most. She needed help from people with real power to investigate and prosecute federal crimes. The decision to contact the FBI wasn't easy. Jasmine had always believed in working within the legal system, but the legal system itself was compromised in this case. Judge Matthews was the system, at least in his courtroom, and he was using that power to protect his own interests while hurting innocent people. She spent an entire weekend organizing all the evidence she had gathered, bank records showing unusual financial relationships, case records showing suspicious patterns in judicial decisions, witness statements from other attorneys who had experienced similar treatment, property records connecting the judge to companies that regularly appeared in his courtroom. When she laid it all out on her dining room table, even she was surprised by how much evidence she had collected. It looked like something from a crime television show, except this was real life, and real people had been hurt by what Judge Matthews was doing. On Monday morning, Jasmine called the FBI field office in Dallas. She had never made this kind of call before, and she wasn't sure exactly what to expect. The receptionist transferred her to Agent Rebecca Torres, who specialized in public corruption cases. "Agent Torres," Jasmine began carefully, "I'm an attorney, and I believe I've uncovered evidence of judicial corruption involving bribery and civil rights violations. I'd like to set up a meeting to discuss what I've found." Agent Torres had been investigating public corruption for over 8 years, and she could tell immediately that this wasn't a frivolous complaint. Jasmine's voice was calm and professional, and she spoke like someone who understood the legal system and knew the difference between personal disagreements and actual criminal behavior. They met the next day at the FBI office. Jasmine brought copies of everything she had gathered, organized in clearly labeled folders with detailed summaries of her findings. Agent Torres was impressed by the thoroughness of the presentation and the quality of the evidence. "Ms. Crockett," Agent Torres said after reviewing the materials, "what you've brought us is extremely serious. If these allegations are accurate, Judge Matthews could be facing federal charges for conspiracy, bribery, and deprivation of civil rights under color of law. These are charges that carry significant prison time." The FBI moved quickly once they understood the scope of the corruption. Within days, they had opened a formal investigation and begun gathering additional evidence through methods that weren't available to Jasmine as a private attorney. They obtained federal subpoenas for bank records, phone records, and business documents. What they found was even worse than what Jasmine had discovered on her own. Judge Matthews had been receiving regular payments from Pinnacle Development Group, disguised as consulting fees and property investments. The payments always came shortly after he made favorable rulings in cases where Pinnacle or its subsidiaries were defendants. The FBI also discovered recorded phone conversations between Judge Matthews and executives at Pinnacle Development Group. In these conversations, they discussed specific cases and specific outcomes they wanted. The judge would promise to handle cases in ways that benefited the company, and the company would promise continued financial support. One conversation was particularly damaging. Judge Matthews was heard saying, "Don't worry about the civil rights lawyers, I know how to handle their type. They usually back down when they realize they're not welcome in my courtroom." Agent Torres played this recording for Jasmine during one of their meetings. Hearing the judge's voice saying these things was both satisfying and infuriating. It proved that his behavior toward her hadn't been personal. It had been part of a deliberate strategy to protect his criminal enterprise. The investigation expanded as more evidence came to light. FBI agents interviewed dozens of attorneys, court staff members, and former clients who had been affected by Judge Matthews's corrupt practices. They found that the corruption had been going on for at least 5 years, affecting hundreds of cases and thousands of people who had been denied fair treatment in the legal system. The agents also discovered that Judge Matthews had been sharing information about upcoming cases with Pinnacle Development Group, giving them advance notice about lawsuits, and allowing them to prepare defenses or settlement offers before their opponents even knew what was happening. As the federal investigation continued, Jasmine found herself working closely with the FBI team. Her legal expertise and her personal experience with Judge Matthews made her invaluable in understanding how the corruption had operated and identifying other potential victims. The hardest part for Jasmine was realizing how many people had been hurt by Judge Matthews's actions. Families who had been discriminated against and then denied justice in his courtroom. Attorneys who had been intimidated into dropping legitimate cases. Clients who had accepted unfair settlements because they were afraid to fight in a system that was rigged against them. But there was also something deeply satisfying about seeing the investigation unfold. Every piece of evidence that came to light, Every recorded conversation that was discovered, every financial record that was uncovered, it all proved that her decision to fight back had been the right one. Agent Torres kept Jasmine updated on the progress of the investigation, and the news got better every week. The case against Judge Matthews was becoming stronger and stronger. The evidence was overwhelming, and federal prosecutors were confident they could secure convictions on multiple felony charges. As the investigation neared its conclusion, Jasmine realized that what had started as one terrible day in court had become something much bigger. Her decision to document and investigate Judge Matthews's behavior had exposed a criminal conspiracy that had been operating for years. She had helped bring justice not just for herself, but for all the people who had been wronged by a corrupt system. The FBI was ready to make arrests, and Judge Matthews had no idea what was coming. All the power and influence he had abused for so long wouldn't be able to protect him from federal agents with arrest warrants and overwhelming evidence of his crimes. It was a Thursday morning, 3 months after that terrible day in Judge Matthews' courtroom, when everything finally came together. Jasmine was in her office preparing for a different case when Agent Torres called her with news she had been waiting to hear. "It's happening today," Agent Torres said simply. "We're making the arrest this morning. I wanted you to know before it hits the news." Jasmine felt a wave of emotions wash over her: relief, satisfaction, nervousness, and something that felt like justice finally being served. After months of investigation, documentation, and careful legal work, the moment of truth had arrived. Judge Matthews started that Thursday morning the same way he had started hundreds of other mornings. He arrived at the courthouse early, reviewed his calendar, and prepared for another day of wielding power from behind the bench. He had no idea that federal agents were already in the building, waiting for the right moment to execute their arrest warrant. The arrest happened in his chambers, away from the public areas of the courthouse. FBI agents had coordinated with courthouse security to make sure everything went smoothly and safely. When Agent Torres and her team entered Judge Matthews' private office, he was sitting behind his desk reading case files and drinking coffee like it was any other normal day. "Judge Harrison Matthews," Agent Torres announced, showing her badge and credentials. "You're under arrest for conspiracy, bribery, and deprivation of civil rights under color of law." The judge's face went completely white. For a man who had spent years intimidating attorneys and controlling his courtroom with an iron fist, he suddenly looked small and powerless. The federal agents read him his rights while courthouse staff and other judges watched in shocked silence. Word spread through the courthouse within minutes. Attorneys who were preparing for hearings stopped what they were doing. Court clerks whispered to each other in the hallways. Security guards stood at attention as the judge who had ruled over them for 15 years was led away in handcuffs. Jasmine heard about the arrest from 3 different people within an hour. Her phone kept ringing with calls from other attorneys who wanted to know if she had heard the news. Many of them had suspected something was wrong for years, but nobody had been brave enough or determined enough to do anything about it. The arrest was just the beginning. Within hours, FBI agents were also arresting executives from Pinnacle Development Group who had been part of the bribery scheme. The conspiracy had involved multiple people over several years, and federal prosecutors wanted to make sure everyone who had participated faced appropriate consequences. Local news stations picked up the story by lunchtime. "Federal agents arrest local judge in corruption investigation" was the headline that ran on every channel and website in Dallas. The story described years of systematic corruption, bribery, and the deliberate denial of civil rights to vulnerable plaintiffs. What made the story even more powerful was that reporters were able to interview some of the attorneys and clients who had been affected by Judge Matthews's corrupt practices. People who had been too afraid to speak up before were now willing to tell their stories publicly. David Rodriguez, the employment discrimination attorney who had been questioned about his qualifications, spoke to reporters about the intimidation he had faced. "I always knew something wasn't right, but I never imagined it was this systematic and this corrupt," he said. Lisa Thompson, who handled housing rights cases, described how she had started avoiding Judge Matthews's courtroom because of the hostile treatment she received. "No attorney should have to choose between representing their clients effectively and facing personal attacks from the bench, she told a local television reporter. The Mitchell family, Jasmine's original clients from the housing discrimination case, were interviewed by several news outlets. They described their shock at what had happened in the courtroom, and their gratitude that someone had been willing to fight for justice even when it wasn't easy. Ms. Crockett could have just walked away after what happened to her, Mrs. Mitchell said during one interview. Instead, she stood up for all of us who had been treated unfairly. She's a real hero. Within a week, Judge Matthews had been suspended from the bench pending the outcome of his criminal trial. A new judge was assigned to review all of his recent cases to determine which ones might have been affected by his corrupt practices. The State Judicial Commission opened its own investigation into how the corruption had gone undetected for so long. The criminal trial took place 6 months later. The evidence that Jasmine had helped gather, combined with what the FBI had discovered during their investigation, was overwhelming. Recorded phone conversations, bank records, witness testimony, and documented patterns of corrupt behavior painted a clear picture of systematic criminal activity. Judge Matthews pleaded guilty to all charges rather than face the risk of an even longer sentence at trial. Federal prosecutors recommended a 12-year prison sentence, which the new judge accepted. The executives from Pinnacle Development Group also pleaded guilty and received sentences ranging from 3 to 8 years. For Jasmine, the conclusion of the case was deeply satisfying but also bittersweet. Justice had been served, but it came at the cost of revealing how many people had been hurt by the corruption over the years. Hundreds of discrimination cases had been affected. Thousands of people had been denied fair treatment in the legal system, but there were also positive changes that came from the investigation. The local bar association implemented new procedures for reporting judicial misconduct. The courthouse installed better oversight systems to monitor judicial behavior. Other judges became more careful about avoiding even the appearance of impropriety. Most importantly, attorneys who represented discrimination victims no longer had to worry about facing retaliation in Judge Matthews's courtroom. The legal system wasn't perfect, but it was fairer and more just because one person had been willing to stand up when standing up wasn't easy. Jasmine's original housing discrimination case was eventually heard by a different judge and resulted in a significant victory for the Mitchell family. But the real victory was much bigger than any single case. It was the victory of proving that corruption can be exposed, justice can be served, and one person's courage can make a difference for thousands of others. Years later, when young attorneys asked Jasmine for advice about handling difficult situations in court, she always told them the same thing: document everything, trust your instincts, and never be afraid to fight for what's right, even when it seems impossible.